It was a typical Friday night, and as usual, Mike's sister Emily was curled up on the couch, eyes glued to her laptop, immersed in her latest BL drama. The characters on the screen were impossibly handsome, their every interaction dripping with tension. Mike stood behind her, arms crossed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Seriously, another one, he said, smirking as the two male leads on the screen exchanged long, lingering glances. This is, what, the third time this week? Emily didn't even look up from her screen. You don't get it, Mike. It's not just about the romance. It's about the build-up, the slow burn, the emotional connection. Sure, Mike interrupted, leaning over to squint at the screen. Emotional connection. They've been staring at each other for like 2 minutes straight, without saying anything. It's awkward. It's not awkward, Emily said, swatting at him. It's intense. You just don't understand the genre. I don't need to. I like girls, remember? No offense, but watching two guys making goo-goo eyes at each other isn't exactly my thing. Keep laughing, Mike, Emily said jokingly, with a smirk. One day, you're gonna wake up in a BL world, and we'll see how you handle it. Mike rolled his eyes. Yeah, right. I'm straight, Emily. No danger of me falling into your fantasy world. With that, he grabbed a soda from the fridge and headed off to bed, still chuckling to himself. Emily and her BL obsession, as if that world could ever apply to him. The next morning, Mike woke up feeling groggy. He blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, but something felt off. The light filtering through the window seemed softer, warmer, like it had been edited with a romantic filter. The bed under him was bigger, softer, and the sheets were satin, definitely not his usual beat-up comforter. Mike sat up, rubbing his eyes. Where the hell am I? The room was pristine, with elegant white furniture and tasteful decor that looked like something out of an Instagram photo shoot. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, and everything had this almost cinematic quality. Then he heard a voice. Morning, Mike. Mike's heart nearly stopped. He turned, and standing by the door was a guy. Tall, chiseled, with messy dark hair and the kind of smirk that said he was used to getting whatever he wanted. The kind of guy that would definitely star in one of Emily's BL dramas. Who are you? Mike stammered, standing up quickly. And where am I? The guy chuckled, stepping closer. You don't remember. Last night was intense. Was last night too intense that you're still disoriented this morning? He said jokingly. Mike's face went red instantly. Wait, what? No, I don't know what you're talking about. The guy tilted his head, his smirk growing wider. Come on, don't act shy now. You've been sending mixed signals for days. But after last night, I think we both know where this is headed. Mike's brain was in full panic mode. What? Mixed signals? Last night? Where is this headed? I'm straight, Mike blurted out, backing up against the bed. Whatever you think happened last night, it didn't. Trust me. The guy chuckled again, his eyes narrowing in amusement. Sure you are. Whatever helps you sleep at night. Mike's mind was racing. This isn't happening. I'm not in a BL drama. This guy's not my love interest. I'm straight. But no matter how many times he said it, the look in the guy's eyes was intense. Flirtatious, almost predatory suggested otherwise. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, not from attraction but from sheer panic. For the rest of the day, Mike wandered around, trying to figure out where the hell he was and how he could get out. He soon realized that this wasn't just some random, unfamiliar place. He was in the world of a BL drama. Every interaction he had screamed romantic tension. The stares, the way people looked at him. It was all straight out of the shows Emily watched. But the worst part was the attention he was getting from two guys. Yes, two guys. Later that day, Mike found himself in a cafe, nervously sipping his drink as yet another guy approached him. This one had a different vibe. He had blonde hair, bright smile, a golden retriever energy that was hard to ignore. He slid into the seat across from Mike with ease, like they were old friends. Mike, you disappeared on me last night, the guy said with a pout that was way too charming for Mike's comfort. Sorry, Mike said, glancing around nervously. He hadn't even remembered this guy existed, let alone why he would be upset. The guy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low murmur. You've been spending a lot of time with him lately. Should I be jealous? Mike's heart raced again. Jealous? Of who? The other guy. He found out his name was Nate. This was insane. Before he could answer, the door to the cafe swung open, and in walked Nate, the dark-haired, smirking guy from that morning. His eyes locked onto Mike immediately, and his jaw clenched when he saw the blonde guy sitting across from him. Mike's stomach dropped. Oh no, not a love triangle. Nate walked over, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. He leaned on the back of Mike's chair, practically looming over him. Am I interrupting something? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mike's palms were sweaty. He couldn't figure out why he was nervous, but he found his heart racing as he is caught between two incredibly attractive guys. This is too much. I'm just a guy trying to get out of here. No. We were just talking, Mike said quickly, but then tilted his head slightly, wondering why he was explaining himself. Talking? Nate repeated, his voice dangerously low. Funny, because it looks like he's trying to move in on my territory. Mike's eyes widened. Territory? I'm not a piece of land. The blonde guy laughed softly, his eyes still fixed on Mike. Territory, huh? Mike's his own person. Maybe he likes spending time with me. I don't, Mike shouted, standing up so quickly he almost knocked his chair over. I don't like spending time with either of you. I'm straight. Get that through your heads. Both guys stared at him, and for a brief moment, the cafe was silent. Then Nate smiled slowly, a dangerous glint in his eye. We'll see about that. As the days passed, Mike learned that they were all roommates, which made things only get more complicated. Everywhere Mike went, he found himself in increasingly intimate situations with both Nate and the blonde guy who he eventually learned was named Eric. Whether it was Nate pinning him against a wall, their faces inches apart, or Eric casually draping an arm around his shoulders, leaning in way too close for comfort, Mike couldn't catch a break. There was one particularly heart-pounding moment when Mike found himself alone with Nate in the apartment's kitchen. He had been minding his own business, making a sandwich, when Nate came up behind him, trapping him against the counter. You're always running away, Nate murmured, his breath warm against Mike's neck. But I can see it in your eyes, Mike. You don't really want to leave. Mike's heart raced. He could feel the heat radiating off Nate's body, their proximity making it impossible to think clearly. Why does it feel so intense? I'm straight. You're wrong, Mike stammered, trying to edge away, but Nate didn't budge. Am I? Nate's voice was soft, dangerous, as his fingers lightly brushed against Mike's arm. Then why are you blushing? Mike's face burned. He shoved Nate away, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. I'm not. I'm just. He didn't even know how to finish that sentence. Nate's smirk widened, but before he could say anything else, Eric burst into the room, his expression darkening at the sight of them so close together. What's going on here? Eric demanded, his voice sharp. Mike threw his hands up in frustration. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I just want to make a sandwich. Eventually, Mike found himself exhausted. No matter how many times he insisted he was straight, the world around him refused to believe it. Nate and Eric were relentless in their pursuit, both of them competing for his attention. Mike had always been straightforward. He liked girls, but now, he's left confused because every glance from Nate, every soft touch or teasing word, stirred something inside him that he couldn't explain. And then there was Eric. Eric had become more possessive over time. The once flirty banter had shifted into something darker, more obsessive. Every time Mike was with Nate, Eric was there, watching with a burning intensity that made Mike uncomfortable. At first, Mike had tried to laugh it off, telling himself Eric was just being overly friendly. But lately, it was clear that Eric's jealousy was becoming a problem. One evening, Mike found himself at a fancy dinner birthday party, organized by Nate's friend he hadn't figured out yet. He had been roped into attending by Nate, who had insisted it would be fun. Mike hadn't had a good excuse to say no. And now here he was, dressed in formal clothes, sitting at a candlelit table with Nate on one side and Eric on the other. Mike shrunk into himself as they glared at each other. I don't understand why you always have to be so close to him, Eric muttered under his breath, his eyes locked on Nate. It's like you're doing it on purpose. Nate smirked, casually resting his arm on the back of Mike's chair. Maybe I am. What's it to you? Mike stiffened, glancing between them nervously. Guys, come on. It's just dinner. Let's not make this weird. Oh, it's already weird, Eric said darkly, his hand gripping his fork so tightly his knuckles turned white. His gaze flicked to Mike, softening slightly but still intense. You need to realize, Mike, that Nate's playing with you. I'm the one who's serious. I'm the one who actually cares. Nate's expression hardened. Don't act like you know what's best for him. I know enough to see what you're doing. You think you can seduce him, string him along, but you don't have any real feelings for him. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. This was exactly the kind of drama he had seen in Emily's BL series. The intense jealousy, the possessiveness, and the sense of being caught in the middle of something he couldn't control. But the worst part was that, deep down, part of him was starting to enjoy the attention, even if it confused the hell out of him. Before he could respond, Nate's hand brushed against the back of his neck, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine. Mike's smart enough to make his own decisions. Nate said, his voice low and smooth. He doesn't need you to protect him from me. Mike quickly snatched his fork from the table and started shoving steak down his throat, earning looks from people in other tables. But he didn't care and just wanted to make them stop talking about him as if he wasn't there. He ended up almost choking as Nate started rubbing his back and other to calm him down. Hey, easy babe, Nate said, still rubbing his back slowly. Mike swallowed hard, trying to ignore the heat spreading through him from Nate's touch. I'm straight. I'm straight. I'm straight, he chanted in his head. But it was getting harder and harder to believe it. The tension between the three of them continued to build over the next few days. Every time Eric tried to pull Mike away, Nate was right there, with that ever-present smirk that made Mike's heart race for reasons he didn't want to admit. One night, after a particularly heated argument between Nate and Eric, with Mike, of course, being the main reason without even doing anything, Mike found himself alone with Nate in the apartment. Eric had stormed out in the pouring rain. After getting called out for being too obsessive and perverted towards Mike, Nate had found pictures of Mike poking out under his pillows that morning. He had gone there to tell him his DoorDash order had arrived, but he was in the shower. He couldn't help but notice the pictures of Matt. When he would come out of his room with no shirt on, or when he would bend down to grab something from the floor or from a lower surface, Mike was pacing, trying to calm his racing thoughts, but Nate was lounging on the couch, watching him with those intense, dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. You're gonna wear a hole in the floor if you keep pacing like that, Nate said casually, stretching out. His shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a sliver of toned skin that Mike tried to avoid looking at. I don't know how to deal with all this, Mike muttered, running a hand through his hair. This isn't normal. None of this is normal. Nate's smirk softened into something more sincere, and he stood up, walking over to Mike. What's so abnormal about it? You've got two guys fighting over you. That's not the worst situation to be in, you know. He then twisted his face in disgust, then continued. Except when one of them is kinda weird. Mike flushed. It is when you're straight. Nate stopped in front of him, so close that Mike could feel the heat radiating from his body. Are you? He asked quietly, his voice low and teasing. Because I've seen the way you look at me, Mike. The way you react when I touch you. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist that yes, he was straight, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he just stood there, frozen as Nate reached out, his fingers lightly grazing Mike's arm. It's okay if you're confused, Nate murmured, stepping even closer. But don't lie to yourself. Mike's pulse raced, and before he knew what he was doing, he blurted out, I'm not lying. But even to his own ears, the words sounded weak, like he didn't fully believe them anymore. Nate's smirk returned, but there was a softness in his eyes that Mike hadn't noticed before. Then why do you keep thinking about me? Mike's breath hitched. How does he know? It was true. He had been thinking about Nate, too much, if he was being honest with himself. There were moments, late at night, when Mike couldn't get Nate's voice out of his head, or the way his hands felt when they brushed against him, or the way his heart would pound whenever Nate got too close. And now, standing here in the dim light of the apartment, with Nate so close he could feel the heat from his body, Mike's mind was a mess of confusing thoughts and emotions. I don't know, Mike admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Nate's hand cupped the side of Mike's face, his thumb gently brushing against his cheek. That's okay, he said softly, leaning in closer. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Mike's breath caught in his throat, his mind spinning. But when Nate's lips brushed against his, soft and tentative, Mike didn't pull away. The kiss was brief, just a whisper of contact, but it left Mike reeling. His heart was pounding, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and, if he was being honest, desire. Nate stepped back slightly, giving Mike space to breathe, but his eyes stayed locked on him, waiting for a reaction. Mike stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to process what had just happened. I kissed a guy. No, he kissed me, but I didn't stop him. Nate's smirk softened into a smile, but before Mike could say anything, the door to the apartment slammed open. Eric stood there, drenched from the rain, his eyes blazing with fury as they landed on Mike and Nate. You kissed him? Eric snarled, his fists clenched at his sides. You really think you can just steal him away like that? Mike felt a surge of panic. Oh no, not this again. Eric, calm down, Mike said quickly, stepping forward, but Eric's eyes were locked on Nate, pure jealousy radiating off him in waves. Calm down, Eric repeated, his voice shaking with anger. You think I'm just going to sit back and watch you take him from me? Nate stepped in front of Mike, his posture protective. He's not yours to take, Eric. Mike can make his own decisions. Eric's eyes flicked to Mike, softening for a moment. But you know I'm serious about you. Mike. I'm the one who's been there for you this whole time. Not him. Mike's stomach twisted in knots. He didn't want to hurt Eric, even after he'd done, but he couldn't ignore the way Nate made him feel. The way his heart raced whenever Nate was near. The way his thoughts seemed to spiral out of control whenever Nate touched him. But he was also angry at Eric. He didn't even apologize after what he had done. By being there for me, do you mean keeping me underneath your pillow so you can jerk off to my pictures? 'Cause that's how I remember you being there for me. This is so stupid. I want to go home, Mike said honestly, his voice trembling. He ran up the stairs to his room, leaving Eric stunned and Nate proud that he had stood up to him. Days passed, and the atmosphere between the three of them only grew more charged. Mike had initially thought Eric would back down, but Eric's obsession with Mike became more intense, his every interaction laced with jealousy and possessiveness. Meanwhile, Nate remained calm and collected, always offering Mike space when he needed it, but never backing down from their growing connection. One night, after a long day of awkward encounters and heated glances, Mike found himself alone with Nate again. They were sitting on the balcony, the cool night air soothing against Mike's flushed skin. Nate had been quiet, giving Mike time to sort through his feelings. But tonight, something in the air felt different. I've been thinking, Mike said suddenly, breaking the silence, about everything. Nate glanced at him, his expression unreadable. And Mike took a deep breath. I don't know what's happening to me. I've never felt this way before. But when I'm with you, I can't think straight. It's like you're always in my head, and I can't get you out. Nate's lips twitched into a soft smile. Sounds like you've got it bad, then. Mike laughed, but it was a nervous sound, full of uncertainty. I don't know if I'm ready for this, for any of it. Nate leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on Mike. You don't have to be ready, but you don't have to run from it either. Mike hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Do you really care about me? Nate's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. Yeah, Mike, I do. And I'm not going anywhere, no matter how long it takes you to figure things out. Mike nodded, his heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through him. For the first time since waking up in this world, he felt a strange sense of peace. And it was because of Nate. The next day, it was raining. The rain drummed steadily against the window, creating a rhythm that matched Mike's racing heartbeat. He had tried to avoid Nate all day, but it seemed the universe, or maybe this strange world he'd been thrown into, had other plans. It was almost impossible to think clearly around Nate now, especially after that kiss. His mind was a mess of confusion, denial, and desire. The way Nate looked at him, with those eyes that seemed to know every thought running through his mind, made it harder for Mike to resist. He could still feel the lingering touch of Nate's hand on his face from that night, the soft brush of his lips. Every time Mike closed his eyes, he relived that moment, replaying it over and over, wondering why he hadn't pushed Nate away. This isn't me, Mike kept telling himself. I'm straight. I like girls. I'm not supposed to feel like this. But the more time he spent around Nate, the more those thoughts blurred, and the lines between friendship and something more seemed to disappear. That night, after Eric had gone to one of those fancy parties he was invited to, Nate cornered Mike in the living room. Mike had been trying to get his thoughts together, but Nate always knew how to make the world spin out of control. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his eyes dark and intense, a small smirk playing on his lips. You've been avoiding me, Nate said, his voice low and teasing. Why is that? I haven't, Mike started, but Nate cut him off with a chuckle. You have. Ever since that kiss, you've been running away. Mike swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. I'm just trying to figure things out. Nate took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Mike's face. You're overthinking it, Mike. You feel something for me. I know you do. You can't hide it. Mike's breath hitched as Nate moved even closer, his presence overwhelming. He could smell the faint scent of Nate's cologne, the warmth of his body so close to his own. His heart pounded in his chest, and he hated how his body seemed to betray him, responding to Nate's proximity in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. I don't know what I feel, Mike stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Nate's hand reached out, gently tilting Mike's chin up so their eyes met. You do know, he murmured, his voice soft. You just don't want to admit it. Mike's thoughts spun wildly, torn between the part of him that was screaming this wasn't right and the part of him that wanted nothing more than to give in. His pulse quickened as Nate leaned in, his lips brushing against Mike's ear as he whispered, Stop fighting it. A shiver ran down Mike's spine. I can't stop thinking about you, Mike whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Nate's thumb brushed gently against Mike's jaw, his gaze never leaving Mike's face. Then don't. And before Mike could process what was happening, Nate closed the distance between them, his lips crashing against Mike's with a hunger that sent shivers down his spine. Mike gasped into the kiss, his body instinctively responding as his hands reached up to grip Nate's shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, turning frantic and desperate by the second. Mike's mind went blank as heat surged through him, his entire body alive with sensation. Nate's hands roamed freely, one slipping around Mike's waist, pulling him even closer. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "You don't have to fight this," Nate whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "It's real, Mike. Whatever this is between us, it's real." Mike looked into Nate's eyes, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he stopped running. He didn't know what it all meant, but he knew that right now, being with Nate felt right, and that was enough. The following days passed in a blur. Mike couldn't deny his feelings any longer, no matter how hard he tried. The connection he shared with Nate had grown stronger, and every stolen kiss, every lingering touch only intensified the magnetic pull between them. The next week, Mike had planned to ask Nate out on a date, just the two of them, without Eric looming over them. But just as Mike began to settle into his new reality with Nate, something strange happened. One morning, after cuddling with Nate the previous night, Mike woke up in his own bed, back in the real world. He bolted upright, blinking in confusion. Everything around him was familiar. His messy room, his posters on the wall, his old gaming setup. It was like he had never left. But as the realization settled in, so did the panic. What about Nate? He scrambled out of bed, heart racing. Was it all just a dream? Mike spent the entire day in a daze, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as much as he tried to shake off the surreal feeling, he couldn't forget Nate. The emotions were too real, the connection too strong. He couldn't let it go. Later that evening, as he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, his sister Emily walked in. She plopped down next to him with her usual smirk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mike hesitated, wondering how he could possibly explain what he had been through. But before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. He shot up from the couch, his heart pounding. Emily gave him a curious look, but he ignored it, rushing to the door. When he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. It was Nate, standing there in the doorway, in the real world, with that same smirk that had driven Mike crazy in the BL world. "Miss me?" Nate asked, leaning casually against the doorframe, holding a bouquet of flowers. Mike blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "How are you here?" Nate shrugged, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Guess I couldn't stay away. Besides, I think we have some unfinished business." Mike's heart raced, and without thinking, he pulled Nate into a hug, burying his face in Nate's shoulder. "I thought you were gone," he mumbled. Nate chuckled, hugging him back. "Not a chance. I'm not going anywhere." Later that day, Mike and Nate sat together on the couch, watching one of Emily's BL dramas. Emily was grinning from ear to ear, clearly enjoying the irony of the situation. "So let me get this straight," Emily said, unable to hide her amusement. "You used to tease me for watching BL series, and now you're literally living in one." Mike groaned, covering his face with his hands to hide his blush. "It's not like that." Nate, sitting beside him, smirked. "Oh, it's definitely like that." After their reunion, the two of them had fallen into a comfortable routine. Nate fit seamlessly into Mike's world, and while it felt oddly natural to have him around, Mike still grappled with how to explain it all to himself, let alone anyone else. But with every passing day, his concerns began to fade, replaced by a sense of contentment he hadn't known he needed. Mike had never been in a relationship before, let alone one as unexpected and intense as this. Nate was everything he wasn't prepared for: confident, seductive, and attentive in ways that made Mike's heart race, and despite his initial hesitations, Mike couldn't deny the way Nate made him feel. Mike and Nate had gone out with Emily and her friends for a casual night, just drinks and laughter. But as the night wore on, Mike found himself separated from Nate, surrounded by Emily's chatty friends. One of them, a guy named Ryan, seemed to be paying a little too much attention to Mike, flirting shamelessly while laughing at his jokes. At first, Mike didn't think much of it. He had never been the object of much attention before, and Ryan's harmless banter felt like a friendly gesture. But then he saw Nate across the room, his expression darkening as he watched them from afar. Mike swallowed nervously. He hadn't seen Nate look that intense before. Ryan leaned in closer, his hand brushing against Mike's arm. "So, what's your deal? Single?" Mike felt his face heat up, his mind scrambling to come up with an answer. But before he could respond, a familiar arm wrapped around his waist, pulling him back against a firm chest. "Actually, he's taken." Nate's voice was low, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Ryan blinked, his smile faltering as he glanced between Mike and Nate. Oh, I didn't realize, eh? Nate's grip tightened just slightly, his eyes never leaving Ryan. Now you do. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Mike could feel the heat radiating off Nate. He wasn't used to seeing this possessive side of him, and it sent a strange thrill through him, but at the same time, he didn't want things to escalate. Nate, it's fine, Mike said quietly, placing a hand on Nate's arm in an attempt to calm him. Nate's eyes softened as he looked down at Mike, but there was still a protective gleam in his gaze. You sure? Mike nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. Yeah, I'm sure. Ryan, sensing the awkwardness, quickly excused himself and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Nate and Mike alone. Nate didn't let go, though, keeping his arm around Mike's waist as they moved back toward the rest of the group. You okay? Nate asked, his voice softer now. Mike nodded, feeling his heart race for a different reason. Yeah, but you don't have to worry, you know. I'm with you. Nate's expression softened, and he leaned in to press a gentle kiss to Mike's temple. I know. I don't like seeing other guys try to take what's mine. Mike's stomach fluttered at the possessiveness in Nate's tone, and though he would never admit it, he liked how protective Nate was. It made him feel wanted, cherished in a way he had never experienced before. But there was also something else, a fire that Nate's jealousy ignited. Later that night, as they lay in bed together, the tension from the evening hadn't quite left Mike's mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Nate had looked at him, how possessive he had been. It stirred something deep inside him, something primal. Nate lay beside him, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the thoughts racing through Mike's head, but Mike couldn't ignore it anymore. Without warning, Mike rolled over, his body pressing against Nate's side as he slipped his hand under the hem of Nate's shirt. Nate froze, glancing down at him in surprise. Mike, Nate's voice was thick with curiosity and a touch of amusement. Mike didn't respond with words. Instead, he leaned in, kissing Nate's jaw, then his neck, his hands wandering further up Nate's shirt. Nate let out a breathless chuckle, clearly caught off guard by Mike's sudden boldness. What's gotten into you? Mike pulled back slightly, meeting Nate's gaze. His own heart was pounding, but he was done second-guessing himself. I don't know, he whispered, but I want you. Right now. That was all it took for Nate's playful demeanor to shift. In an instant, he rolled Mike beneath him, his lips crashing against Mike's in a searing kiss. Mike's body responded instinctively, arching into Nate as their hands explored each other's skin with a newfound urgency. It was intense and desperate. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just raw desire. Mike had never felt like this before, like he couldn't get enough of Nate, like he wanted to be consumed by him. And Nate wasn't holding back either. His hands roamed freely, his lips trailing hot kisses down Mike's neck and chest. Every touch, every kiss sent sparks of pleasure coursing through Mike, leaving him breathless and wanting more. As the night melted into morning, Mike lay in Nate's arms, his body still humming with the afterglow of their passion. The end.